So if someone's always thinking about food and obsessed with food and focused on food, I would argue that's not healthy, because that's gonna all of that time and energy thinking about food detracts from other areas of their life and can impair their quality of life in other ways. And so it's not just about the behaviors, but it's about the thought pattern behind it. Is it flexible? Is it balanced? Or is it rigid? Is it sort of all or nothing? And can someone enjoy other areas of their life without food having to sort of impede on that?
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Wellness Dojo Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Craig, and today I'm very excited to welcome our special guest. She is a registered dietitian, an educator, an author, and somebody who inspires other people through understanding and helping treat eating disorders is kind of the specialization. So welcome to the show, Kary Woodruff.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kyle. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, I'm very excited to have you. Thank you for being here. Um, can we start off first? Registered dietitian. We were kind of talking about this beforehand, and I know that's like I think that minimizes all that you have under your belt and everything, but there's a wide range of what that really means in the industry. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be a dietitian, and then get into a little bit more about kind of your world?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, because I think there can be understandably a lot of confusion about what a dietitian means. So a registered dietitian in Canada has the equivalent designation as well. So it's a similar relationship in Canada and the United States. A registered dietitian is someone who has completed the education components required by the accrediting agency over dietetic education. So there are approved programs. And it recently has been required that all dietitians have a master's degree to practice as a registered dietitian. And that starts for anyone who graduates 2024 and thereafter. So if someone had graduated previously as a dietitian with an undergraduate degree, they're certainly able to continue practicing. But moving forward, the requirement is that dietitians have a master's degree. And so they've completed all the required coursework, and they have completed 1,000 to 1,200 hours of essentially like an internship type experiences. We call them supervised practice, but similar to an internship. And then they've sat and taken the RD exam, which is a long, rigorous exam that can really test their knowledge on a whole myriad of nutrition topics. And so if they successfully complete that, they're a registered dietitian. And I just point that out because the term nutritionist is not actually a protected term or a licensed term. And so really anyone could technically call themselves a nutritionist. And I just point that out. So if someone is seeking nutrition guidance, always ask what their credentials are. And according to our healthcare system, only a registered dietitian or a medical provider, a physician, can provide what we call medical nutrition therapy. And that would be nutrition guidance for any sort of condition, even if it's hypertension, if it's diabetes. And so it's helpful to know that if you're seeking out advice for, especially nutrition guidance for a medical condition, but certainly any sort of expertise, just be cautionary with someone who has a designation of a nutritionist, because they may or may not have had sufficient training or education to support that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to point out, because if you are looking for, like you said, like something specific that's, medical, and even myself who coaches with fitness and nutrition, like there's a lot of things that we run into that we're like, well, this is like out of my field
Sure.
of practice. This is out of my scope of practice. And it's important to have those things within your network so that you can continue to help people and continue to get people the help that they need with things like eating disorders, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Which is a medical diagnosis.
Yeah, excellent. How did you get into this field? What got you down this path of nutrition and medicine kind of being together?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't my initial intention. I had an undergraduate degree in psychology, and I really enjoyed that. I knew I would end up pursuing a graduate degree just given the job opportunities within psychology seemed to require a master's degree. And so I took some time off, and then I decided to pursue a master's degree in sports psychology. And sort of the impetus for that was that I had been a Division I lightweight rower. So rowing, or crew as sometimes it's known, is a sport that does have a weight class component. There's only two classes, there's lightweight and heavyweight. And as a lightweight rower, you have to meet a certain weight specification. But additionally, if you're in a if you're in a boat with 4 or 8 people, or 2, you have a weigh-in, but you can have a boat average. And so what that means is, even if the maximum weight, for example, there were many races where the maximum weight for females was 130 pounds, but you had to have a boat average of 125. And so even if all rowers were under 130, if your boat average wasn't 125, it meant that everybody had to lose weight, typically was the approach, in order to meet the boat average. And so what I observed in my high school and college career was that as a team, we would engage in really unhealthful dietary practices that I, now as a sport dietitian, look back and think, oh my goodness, why didn't anyone ever step in? But we would do the sweat runs and the saunas and the wearing the heavy plastic sweatsuits, fasting, not drinking water for days, really, to try to make weight. And I was interested in a graduate degree in sports psychology because I was interested to understand what differentiated individuals who would engage in these pathological, unhealthful behaviors in the season. And then out of season, they'd be fine. They would have a healthy relationship with food, engage in relatively normal dietary practices, whereas other teammates may continue these unhealthy pathological behaviors out of season, even when it wasn't required to have the weigh-ins. And some individuals, I'm gonna now, looking back retrospectively, would guess that they actually went on to develop full-blown eating disorders because of these unhealthful practices. And so I wanted to understand sort of what were some of those differentiating factors. So I went to graduate school for sports psychology because at the University of Utah, there was at the time a faculty member who had some peripheral research looking at eating disorders among athletes. And through her mentorship, she encouraged me, if this was a field of interest of mine, to consider working an inpatient at a residential treatment center for eating disorders, since I didn't have experience with this patient population outside of my rowing experience. And so it was actually working in a residential treatment center where it really opened my eyes to understanding what it looks like to have a clinical eating disorder. And I'm generalizing, certainly, but it really piqued my interest. And specifically, I would see the work that the residents were doing with their therapists. I wasn't sitting in a one-on-one therapy sessions, but I would observe group sessions and then just hear the residents talk about their one-on-one therapeutic sessions. And I was, I admit, almost even overwhelmed with the therapeutic work that seemed to be required to work with this population. But I was really intrigued by the work that the dietitians were doing with the patients. And that was something that I wanted to learn more about. And so I started investigating nutrition more and more, and really just the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. So I graduated with the degree in sports psychology, but I entered directly into a master's program in sport nutrition. And that's what gave me the tools to work as a sport dietitian. And so I graduated and worked at an orthopedic hospital that specialized in addition to orthopedic surgeries, worked a lot with athletes who were training at up to very high levels And so I was able to work with athletes in that context. And because of my experience of working with patients and patients with eating disorders, I ended up being referred athletes who had disordered eating and eating disorders. And so I'd say for about 12 years, and that became my area of focus, was working with athletes and also non-athletes who had either disordered eating or a diagnosis of an actual eating disorder. And I still work with some patients even now and continue to peripherally be involved in some research as well.
Yeah.
So a rather circuitous path, which I think is not unusual, but that's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, no, I think it's really cool how you as the athlete then were able to take your experience there and with like able to reflect and see kind of what your experience was with eating and stuff and with weight management for that specific thing, and then go on to have a career where you can kind of give back and use that experience to help other people. I think that's super cool and very commendable as well. So good job with that.
Oh, thank you.
Um, you mentioned disordered eating and eating disorder. Can we help decipher like what exactly classifies as an eating disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important area to clarify. So an eating disorder is a clinically diagnosed disorder. It's diagnosed by the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is what psychiatrists and medical providers use to provide any sort of mental health diagnosis. And an eating disorder includes a diagnosis of anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, binge eating disorder, and there are some other maybe more atypical eating disorders included as well. And so when we think of an eating disorder, that typically falls within anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder. That represents a relatively small percent of the population. It's estimated that 1 in 10 Americans, for example, will have an eating disorder at some point in their life, but actual prevalence is really difficult to ascertain because of the stigma associated with eating disorders. We think it's probably underdiagnosed, especially among certain populations, including men and other marginalized populations. So it's hard to really capture what an accurate prevalence is, but it's probably a relatively low percentage of the population. Disordered eating, however, represents a whole spectrum of eating behaviors that fall in between what we would consider to be normal, healthful dietary patterns and having a healthy relationship with food and the clinical eating disorder diagnosis. And it can encompass a really wide variety of behaviors and thought patterns around food. So it can include, really restrictive a dietary intake that might not be as severe as what we would see with anorexia nervosa, but still could characterize really significant restriction, consuming chronically insufficient amounts of nutrients and energy calories. It could include restricting entire food groups because of a belief of how that might improve their health. Sometimes related to misinformation. Most dieting behaviors, as we think of traditional dieting behaviors, can fall within that spectrum of disordered eating. And to me, what helps to understand when do healthful nutrition related behaviors and dietary behaviors start to shift into disordered eating, I ask questions such as, well, how are these eating behaviors impacting your quality of life? And how are they affecting your social interactions? How do they enhance or maybe detract from how you experience going out and hanging out with your friends and eating in a social context, maybe traveling? Do you ever have anxiety around food? Do you ever stress out about food and food choices? And so when we start to see those impairments or negative effects on quality of life, I think that's where we start to see a shift towards more disordered eating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting hearing you describe it in a way, like in a society where you could argue we overdiagnose a lot of things. It's very interesting to hear this being described as something that's maybe underdiagnosed, right? Or something that's
Yeah.
underrecognized.
Well, because it's so pervasive, right, Kyle? So I think it's just so socially acceptable to be dieting. It's almost more
Mhm.
the norm rather than the anomaly. And so when these behaviors are are so socially acceptable and really socially encouraged, you think about reasons why people go on to diets. Well, I almost call it, FOMO is a significant contributing factor, that fear of missing out of like, oh, wow, she's seeing these amazing results with this dietary pattern. I'm going to do it too. And it really, especially through social media, but just really even this really precedes social media, just cultural factors that really promote these potentially unhealthy behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's something that we just brush over and kind of sweep under the rug very
Yeah.
often in our lives, right? Where it's like, oh, it's normal to be anxious about going to a party and, not knowing if I should eat this food or not, or not eating any at the party and then going home and binging in the evening and those types of things. You're right, they do feel very almost acceptable in today's society. And I'm curious, and this kind of get into the world of the athlete a little bit too, is, in a society that's so diet centered, how does one know when they should be kind of being very strict, like an athlete who's trying to make weight, whether it's for rowing or maybe it's a fighter who needs to make weight for their weight class and then put it all back on very quickly, wrestling, that kind of thing. How do we know like when it's acceptable and when it's maybe pushing our boundaries a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's another great question. Not one I think that we've um, culturally really embraced a consistent response to. There are ways in which we can support our athletes and set boundaries so that the behaviors in which they're engaging can be limited to specific timeframes and still be done in a way that doesn't significantly risk their health.
Mm.
And that period of time being limited being an emphasis, and that when they're after the weigh-ins and after that competition season is over, that we are monitoring and working with them to ensure that sufficient and adequate nutrient intake follows. We also need to set boundaries and parameters around what we encourage and allow our athletes to do in terms of weight goals, right? So US Wrestling has done a much better job of trying, and it doesn't mean it's a perfect system, but a much better job of trying to prevent some of these severe body weight regulation behaviors by recognizing that an athlete needs to be within a certain percentage of their weight at the beginning of their season, and that they are not allowed to compete at a level that would be below a considered healthful range of body weight loss. And they also measure hydration status to make sure that wrestlers are not engaging in unhelpful practices to compromise their hydration status that would allow them to risk their health even more. And so there are ways that we can set up structures and boundaries to say, this is not an appropriate amount of weight loss. This would not be an appropriate weight goal. Let's work to find ways to support your athletic performance within what would be an appropriate range. But certainly not all sports have adopted these practices. And that is just within weight regulation sports. Certainly, there are many, many sports that don't have officials that are overseeing weight regulation. And so, but also sports that do have body weight pressures. So thinking of either aesthetic sports like gymnastics or figure skating, or thinking of sports where having a higher power to weight ratio and having a lower body mass can be advantageous for performance, like cycling, running, especially uphill cycling. In all of these sports, they're favored to have a very lean body composition, low amount of body fat. And so those pressures can really encourage athletes to lose significant amount of weights, sometimes in potentially unhealthful ways. And there are not these sort of external boundaries set up in place, regulations, policies to prevent some of these unhealthful behaviors.
Yeah, and at a very high level, they're almost fortunate to have some of these kind of overseeing bodies that can
Mhm.
help protect with that. Whereas when you get into more amateur sports, a lot of time it's very unguided, and there's athletes who are just trying to manipulate on their own. And I imagine that can get very dangerous as well. Um, but just with weight classes in general, and just with, like you said, the particular physiques that people are trying to maintain for a sport or for a competition, do you believe that athletes are more at risk for disordered eating and eating disorders than the average person?
I think there certainly are generally, yes, but that's a generalization. And that's because some of the same characteristics and personality factors that set someone up to be a successful athlete, which also requires genetics and lots of other components, but
Yeah.
some of the personality factors that can predispose successful athletic performance include, being very driven, exhibiting high amounts of self-discipline, self-control, and those same behaviors, when translated to dietary intake, can result in overly rigid dietary patterns, overly rigid thought patterns and approaches to food that could predispose someone to have, engage in disordered eating and potentially develop an eating disorder. Perfectionism is another great example. So that perfectionistic thinking can really prompt an athlete to seek high levels of performance, but that same perfectionism that can result in sort of this all or nothing, black or white thinking, can really predispose someone to unhelpful dietary patterns. And that, along with other risk factors, could increase risk for an eating disorder.
You mentioned before that when you first got into this field, had a spark of interest in why some athletes tended to continue with the poor eating decisions were kind of more pulled towards that disordered eating, whereas some other athletes were more able to just kind of get back to their regular life. What did you find when looking at that on like I imagine some of those characteristics that you just listed would play into that, but what else did you find that kind of was the difference maker in those situations?
Yeah, so certainly personality factors, but personality factors are just one component, and that in of itself would not be as likely to predispose someone to actually developing a full-blown eating disorder, certainly disordered eating. But other risk factors include a history of trauma, for example, that can significantly increase one's risk. Genetics, we know that there are genetic predispositions that could increase one's risk, especially if someone has a first-degree family member who had an eating disorder as well. There are genes that have been identified to increased risk, that have been associated with increased risk. There are other anxiety and personality disorders, but anxiety disorders or mood disorders, I should say, including anxiety and depression, other comorbidities that also can increase one's risk. And so often it's sort of this intermix between individual factors like genetics, for example, sociocultural factors, it could be biological factors, and it's this sort of conflux of this, all these factors coming together that increase risk. So one risk factor in of itself might be less likely, but when you introduce more than one risk factor, then you see heightened risk.
Yeah, and is like therapeutic intervention a big part of that as well, I would imagine, where it's like somebody also has to have the self-awareness to recognize that there might be a problem here based off of things that you mentioned before. Like, I recognize that I have social anxiety around food or different types of things that you might give you a signal. I imagine there has to be a willingness and ability to go and actually seek help for it as well in order to
Yeah,
stop it in its tracks.
yeah. I mean, self-awareness is important and not sufficient, right? Because someone could be engaging
Yeah.
in very unhealthy behaviors like self-induced vomiting. They're probably aware that's not healthy, but they may or may not be willing to change it. And
Yeah.
so that self-awareness, and absolutely, like you identified, finally being at a point where they want to change. And even that doesn't mean that it's easy, but that desire to change really is such an important piece of it as well. And then certainly in terms of the therapeutic component, I, as a sport dietitian, will not work with a patient if they don't also have a therapist, because I respect and recognize my own scope of practice, and the therapeutic work is so important to identify underlying risk factors, to identify triggers, to identify thought processes and thought patterns that really perpetuate the disordered thinking and consequently the behaviors. And so if there's not a therapist to help support the patient and do some of that therapeutic work, it's really much less likely to be successful. And then also having a medical provider on board is so important, and especially a medical provider who's trained in working with eating disorders specifically, to know what to look for, what to recognize. If we think of our female athletes, if a female athlete isn't eating enough and her energy intake and protein intake is insufficient, she's risking compromised bone mineral density accrual. And so oftentimes you can see some of these female athletes, endurance athletes, for example, endurance runners, and they're coming in for chronic stress fractures. But if the medical provider isn't aware that that can actually be a sign or a symptom of insufficient energy intake, they're going to treat the stress fracture, but they're not going to be treating necessarily the underlying cause, which is low energy intake. And so having sport physicians and other medical providers who can recognize the signs and symptoms of disordered eating to help support the medical treatment as well is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, that collaboration, and just when you realize and decide that there's a problem, I need some help with this, I think no matter what it is in your life, it's like creating a network that kind of surrounds you of like everybody who can help me. Like
Yeah.
having these specific people, I think that's so important. Um, can we paint a bit of a picture on what this spectrum really looks like? This kind of spectrum of disordered eating. Um, Even just for myself, in general, like I have a hard time trying to picture like when you picture a spectrum, you picture like this point, this point, this point, this point. What does that spectrum look like in terms of disordered eating?
Yeah, I realized that there's just an audio component here, but I pulled up the spectrum on my screen. It's a great visual. And on the one end, we would have what we would characterize healthful dietary patterns, and included in that would be having a healthy relationship with food, right? Because someone upon appearance could engage in healthful dietary patterns. That doesn't necessarily guarantee they have a healthy relationship with food and have a balanced approach to nutrition. But if we have that healthful spectrum at one end, we have the clinical pattern at the clinical diagnosis at the other end, in between, we can see excessive exercising, specifically for the purpose of losing weight, of using exercise simply as a means to burn calories, not for the other physiological benefits necessarily that exercise can produce. Thinking of yo-yo dieting, of constantly going on and off diets. And typically these types of diets are not sustainable. So the individual goes off the diet. It's common that they gain the weight back, and that prompts another diet. So that yo-yo pattern can be representative of disordered eating. It can include fasting, so trying to compensate for maybe the perception of overeating and then therefore restricting their intake. It can include abuse of laxatives. It can include abuse of other substances to alter their weight, and these substances and behaviors can compromise their health. Just having an excessive preoccupation with one's body weight and their shape can result in disordered eating patterns. So it's the thought processes in addition to just the behaviors that we see in this disordered eating spectrum. Talked a little bit about food elimination diets. Now, certainly there are medical reasons why we might have to restrict specific nutrients. So someone with celiac disease, they need to restrict gluten from their diet, and that's not disordered eating. But someone who's restricting gluten to try to lose weight, and under this misinformed notion that it needs to be restricted, that can start to fall into the pattern of disordered eating patterns. So these really restrictive dietary patterns would also be included in there as well.
Yeah. And it's almost an unfair question because I know that the spectrum is it's probably a little bit different for everybody too, right? On like where do I fall on this spectrum of disordered eating? Because like you said, I think most of us could say like almost everybody's probably tried a diet. Almost everybody's
For
probably
sure.
failed at a diet. It's like, and so like I think we've all experienced some level of I didn't eat all day, and so then I ate like a whole pizza, like that kind of thing. And I think it's important for people to recognize what sounds like the symptoms, right? Like what symptoms am I experiencing from my behaviors, and how are those symptoms impacting my quality of life? If it's impacting my quality of life more and more, then you're probably kind of pushing yourself further on that spectrum, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a great point. Everybody's, what one person's balance looks like is going to look differently than someone else's. And the same dietary behaviors for one individual could be indicative of disordered eating, for someone else may not be, right? And so I think a great example is intermittent fasting and time restricted eating. So it's a pretty popular approach right now. And I have worked with a few patients, clients who have found that intermittent fasting works really well for them. And I'm not talking about over a couple weeks or even a couple months. I've talked to athletes who have been doing intermittent fasting for years. And for them, it supports their quality of life. It supports their health. They're not overly rigid with it. So let's say their mealtime intake is from 12 to 8, and it's a really special social event, an occasion, and it's someone's birthday, and they're served a piece of birthday cake and it's 9 o'clock, they'll still enjoy the birthday cake. They won't have anxiety or stress about it. And
Yeah.
then they can kind of go back to their normal patterns, the next day and not compensate for that. And so certainly so for that person, that time restricted eating or intermittent fasting doesn't have to be indicative of disordered eating. But for other individuals, that time restricted eating can become overly restrictive. It can increase their preoccupation and thoughts about food. So if someone's always thinking about food and obsessed with food and focused on food, I would argue that's not healthy, because that's gonna all of that time and energy thinking about food detracts from other areas of their life and can impair their quality of life in other ways. And so it's not just about the behaviors, but it's about the thought pattern behind it. Is it flexible? Is it balanced? Or is it rigid? Is it sort of all or nothing? And can someone enjoy other areas of their life without food having to sort of impede on that? And those are some of the types of questions that I ask when trying to differentiate between disordered eating and healthful patterns.
Yeah. I mean, intermittent fasting in itself is one that people ask me all the time, like, what do you think of intermittent fasting? I'm like, well, it depends. Like, the same thing. I've talked to a few people who feel like they've had great success doing it. But then I see some other people who maybe ask me, and if I know them personally, I would say, it's absolutely seems like a very dangerous thing for you, because when you look at it from the grand spectrum, like it's essentially binge eating, like
Yeah.
dressed up in like a fancy sales bow, right? Because you're basically saying restrict all day and then eat in a small window of time. It's like somebody who's already struggling with like binging at the end of the night or something, for them to go, I need to lose weight. I'm gonna do intermittent fasting. It's like you're actually kind of exercising the binge in a way.
Yeah, and it becomes a more socially acceptable way to do it, right?
Mhm.
So they can say, "Oh, I can't eat because it's not my window of eating," but it's intermittent fasting, and so it's more socially acceptable, and it allows for that really restrictive pattern, but it perpetuates that mindset, and it can become problematic. And I will say this: I've had several Division I, or let's see, I guess most of them were Division I level athletes who ended up in my office. Now, granted, I work with patients with eating disorders. I'm a biased clinician, but they ended up in my office with a full-blown eating disorder, binging, severe binging, purging behaviors, and very severe eating disorder behaviors, compromised health, at risk for multiple, adverse health effects. It all started with intermittent fasting. Now, and we've seen that over the years with other diets as well. So it can be a helpful pattern for some individuals, but it's just like you pointed out, you have to know the person, or as an individual, you have to know yourself and have that self-awareness of, what are my tendencies, and is this something that could easily, kind of progress from a healthful approach to an unhealthful approach.
Yeah. And like I've experienced this even recently on the other side of the spectrum, where I felt being too kind with myself and
Hmm.
letting myself off the hook too much, where for me that I started to realize that that felt like a misalignment for me. Whereas like I was frustrated because I was letting myself off the hook too much, and like I prided myself on being a little bit more excellent than that. Right. And so there was this misalignment there, but it's a weird balance where you have to try and like really figure out like what's right for me in this moment. But I really like what you said before about how it relates to your actual like quality of life, right?
Yeah.
Because for me, I felt like my quality of life wasn't where it should be because I was letting myself off the hook too much. Whereas somebody else might be more restrictive and recognize that that's affecting things that they want in their quality of life. Like maybe they really, really, um, like they really enjoy the night out with the girls or the guys having drinks and stuff like that. Whereas like maybe for myself, maybe I don't enjoy, I don't value that as much. And so it really does become a very individualized thing, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
What if so if somebody starts to recognize, hey, I think I have a problem. I've tried to change my habits and I'm struggling. I'm frustrated about it. It's creating anxiety and maybe depression or other symptoms. What are some strategies that people can use? Obviously, go and seek advice from somebody who's reputable and has the credentials to help you. What are some other strategies that people can start to use?
Yeah, well, I'll say that I really align with, and my approach of working with patients really aligns with the intuitive eating approach.
Hmm.
And if you or your listeners are not familiar with that, intuitive eating was a book that was first published, gosh, I want to say in 2004, but don't quote me on that. The authors are Evelyn Tribbley and Elise Resch. They're fantastic dietitians, and they have really come to help so many individuals develop a healthy relationship with food. And it is oversimplified as the hunger fullness diet. Now, yes, it absolutely recognizes that we should honor our hunger and honor our fullness, but those aren't the only two principles that define the intuitive eating approach. There's so many other factors that play into our food related decisions. And so if we can come to embrace an intuitive eating approach, that helps to guide us towards a healthy relationship with food. And so, kind of to your point, Kyle, of returning to being too kind to yourself, when you were in that phase. And I listened to your podcast about your recent change in your dietary behaviors after coming out of, I think a lot of people can resonate with the first few years of
Yeah,
COVID and all the
yeah,
changes. And that the point to me that really stands out is we also choose our foods because of how it makes us feel, right? And so I might choose the chocolate cake sometimes because I know it's going to taste really good, and we are allowed and supposed to enjoy food. The enjoyment factor is so important. If human beings didn't enjoy food, then we wouldn't survive as a species, right? So we are biologically wired to enjoy food. We see our hedonic response increases when we're eating, and that's appropriate. But that's also not the only other factor, right? So let's say it's in the morning and I'm deciding what to eat for breakfast, and I know I'm going to have a really busy day that day. I'm going to need energy to get me through the day. Sure, maybe the scones look really delicious that are sitting there, but I also know I think about how am I going to feel if I eat the scone versus how am I going to feel if I chose to eat whole wheat toast with some egg and some fruit, or some Greek yogurt and granola and some berries. And so we also think about, what the food is going to do for our bodies. Now, on the Sunday morning when I'm hanging out with my family, I'll enjoy the scone and that'll be lovely. And on a work day when I need energy and I need something to get me through the day, I'm going to maybe have a bowl of oats with, some Greek yogurt and some blueberries in there because that's what's going to sustain me. And so also thinking about the what we're getting from the food, not just individual nutrients, that is important, but that's just one consideration, but also just how the food's going to make us feel and serve us for the rest of the day. And so it sounds like for you, those foods weren't serving you in the way that you valued. And so I think our values absolutely, should align with our food choices. So again, it's really complex, but hopefully getting back to your question, I think there's a lot of work we can do to become more intuitive eaters. And again, it's not just what do I want to eat in this moment? That's not the only factor that impacts our food decisions with intuitive eating framework. We take lots of factors into consideration, but we do honor flavor and we do honor our hunger and honor our fullness and honor gentle nutrition. There are lots of components that influence those decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because so going back to that episode that I had posted about that, I used some of the language that I used in that episode. I was a little bit hesitant to post it because, I was saying things like, I felt disgusted, I felt ashamed, like these types of things where for a lot of people, and myself included, those are like red flag words, right? Where it's like, I really shouldn't like feel disgusted about how I look and stuff. But credit to what you brought up there is those feelings were associated to misalignment in how I felt about, the reflection of what, like, I often say like our bodies are a direct reflection of our values and daily habits, right? It's like an athlete when you see one. You know what their values are, that they value being in good shape, that they value being athletic and able, um, versus somebody who has other values, right? Um, I think that's where I imagine the psychological side of things really come into play with people who are struggling is like you can almost get into this shame cycle with food very easily, where it's like, yeah, I wanted that food, it felt good for a minute, and then I felt really bad afterwards. And so like that cycle then continues where it's like, well, now that I felt bad, what does my body want to do? It wants to feel better. How am I going to feel better? I know how to feel better. I'm going to have another,
Yep.
cupcake or whatever the case might be. And next thing you know, you're eating an entire box of cookies and you're then just like feel physically like crap and then emotionally like crap too.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And with patients with eating disorders, when they feel that shame, the way that and it's just all in how it's manifested, right? So from a clinical perspective, that shame we try to disentangle. You are not a bad person because of what you ate, right? So feeling guilt over something, guilt is feeling bad about a behavior, but feeling shame, and I just love Brene Brown's research on shame, so that's where some of this comes from. But feeling shame is feeling like I'm a bad person because of what I ate. And it is tricky, right? Because we might have values that we identify as a person that relate to our behaviors, certainly. And so, but for people who feel a lot of shame about their food, I think it can be helpful to try to disentangle some of that, identification with I ate the chocolate cake, so I'm a bad person, versus generally I try to eat healthful foods. I also can enjoy chocolate cake and it doesn't have to compromise who I am, but it gets nuanced there, right? Like it gets tricky. And so it food is so personal and it is emotional and it's supposed to be, and that's where it also presents challenges as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's 100% where people run into big problems, right? Is they blame themselves and we start to label ourselves as well as like, I know I'm this struggle, right? Or like we said, like things can be so easily diagnosed nowadays too. It's like, well, I just label myself as this and like at least now I know that this is what it is. It's like, well, yeah, but that's not what it has to be, right? And when we start to recognize too, like people in diets, for example, I don't know how many times I have people that come to me and they're trying to do a diet. and then they're so angry with themselves when, they slip up on their diet or something. I'm like, you realize your body is trying to maintain balance. That is its job, is to maintain homeostasis. So when you put yourself into a deficit, your body's going to fight like hell to try and maintain that balance, which means it's going to give you extra cravings. It's going to make you move less. It's going to, like, all these things. It's like you're working, it's working against you. So it's 100% normal for you to feel more like you want to have that cupcake.
Yep, absolutely. And I'll also posit that. So there's the physiological and biological response to dietary restriction. And just as you identify, when we go in these really severe calorie deficits, the biological response fights it tooth and nail, and it tries to get back to homeostasis, which it considers to be at that higher weight where there was more reserves and it wasn't feeling so restrictive. I'll also present, and you very well could be aware of this. I think a lot of people don't consider the psychological impact of restriction, right? So the minute, and I'm quoting another great dietitian, Marcy Evans, but she talks about in the context of, she did a great podcast with Paige Smathers on food addiction, and talked about, just sort of that psychological response to restriction. And she gives this great example of, you have an infant, right? So you've had 3 children, and let's say they're sitting on a blanket and they have 20 toys in front of them. And then all of a sudden they see the shiny cell phone, right? And as a parent, you're like, oh shoot, and you grab the cell phone from them. Well, what does that child want? It wants the cell phone. It wants the thing it can't have. And so the minute we tell our brains, I can't have this, or I shouldn't have this, we're just psychologically wired to want that. It's the one thing that we tell ourselves we can't have. And there really is a lot of research to demonstrate that when we have that self-imposed restriction, or self-imposed or not, but we have this restriction, that increases our drive for those foods. And we see that through, looking at brain response to foods. If you present a food that's been restricted, so let's say someone never said that chocolate cake was off limits, and then you have a person who is telling themselves, don't eat the chocolate cake, don't eat the chocolate cake, don't eat the chocolate cake. And you look at their brain response through different types of scans, you see that the person who's been restricted has a much stronger response to that food than the person who was never restricted by that food. And it really speaks to the power of having this sort of restrictive mindset, just how that can influence, our response to food, psychologically, but also then through our behaviors.
Yeah. Yeah. And feel free to correct me on this, but I think that a good approach for that, or a good strategy that people can implement with that, is to really recognize the difference between why we make our decisions, right? Like, where is the good, or what I would call like pleasure, in making decision A versus decision B? Because there's a pleasure to both of those decisions, and there's a pain that comes along with both of those decisions. When I work with people and like break that down with them, almost always when you look at the decision that's more conducive to like what they're trying to achieve, that pleasure is like far more powerful than the pleasure of decision B that's not conducive towards the goals. And same thing with the pain. It's like the
Mhm.
pain with decision B is way more powerful than the pain with decision A. I think when people can start to recognize that more, decision by decision, then it takes that like food off of that pedestal, because you start to realize like it's not as desirable as I initially had thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And having I believe having an all foods fit model works
Mm.
too, because
Yep.
if we say all foods can fit, it's just, how does it fit within the balance of what my goals are and what I know works for me. If you really enjoy something, you can have it. It's how is it in context of the balance of the other foods in your patterns, right? And so like with athletes, I oftentimes will talk about, depending upon their goals, like a 90-10, sometimes even 80-20, goal of, look, if 80 to 90% of the time you're eating healthful foods that are high in nutrients, high in healthy fats, high in protein, high in micronutrients, fruits, vegetables, lean proteins, dairy, if you consume dairy, healthful fats, whole grains, we certainly have wiggle room for foods that we enjoy more, that we eat for satisfaction and for pleasure, and may not be as nutrient dense choices, but we have some wiggle room in there. And I think that more inclusive mindset can just free someone up to not feel the weight and the pressure of every single decision having to be perfect. That's exhausting, right? So we just know from a mental bandwidth standpoint, we're having to make decisions all the time about what's the right choice. And if food is so limited as to what the right choice is, that's just an exhausting way to be. But if we can have a more inclusive approach, it allows us to focus more on those choices that really align with what our goals are. And I think, if I love what you said, because we can balance the temporary benefits with what the long-term effects might be, and the temporary benefit of the enjoyment of that food might be worth it in this moment, or it may not be worth it when we're thinking of, what's the whole picture of making these decisions.
And it's like both are okay as long as you're okay with it afterwards, right?
Yep.
I know we're a little bit we're pressed for time here because I don't want to keep you too long, but you did mention food addiction, and we were talking a little bit about how we label each other. Do we need to be careful about using the label of like being addicted to food?
I think so. I would at least caution someone and ask the question, is that first, to recognize that the science has not established food addiction. We don't have a definition for it. We don't have a defined substance to which we're addicted. If you think of foods high in sugar, are you addicted to sucrose? Are you eating table sugar all the time? Probably not. You're eating a food, and a food has other substances. So we haven't quite narrowed down what it is that we're actually addicted to. We can define types of foods that we tend to have a harder time stopping from eating, or foods that are highly pleasurable, or something that we know that once we start eating, we have a hard time stopping. We can certainly recognize those. We can recognize that they're highly pleasurable because of their processing. They might not be very satiating, and so it's easy to kind of keep eating these foods. There's certainly some overlap with addiction models for other substances, but to label oneself as a food addict, more often than not, I've seen that cause more harm than benefit. Because in the addiction model, it says, I am powerless over this substance. And I have had patients come to me feeling completely powerless over certain foods. And through work with that patient, through intuitive eating approaches, let's say, it's a plate of cookies, and someone, no matter what, they're going to eat the whole plate of cookies. But I've worked with patients get to a point where they can enjoy one cookie, and that is completely satisfying, and they can be done, or they can have more than one, and that's fine too. There's no judgment, there's no shame, there's no guilt. And so to me, that says that that person is not powerless over that food. That food doesn't have power over them by putting in the work and working through their relationship with food, and really try to get out of that restrictive mindset. So I don't think it serves us very well to use that label of a food addict, because it can indicate a sense of powerlessness. I don't think that has to be the case. There's certainly the science on it is still established. I mean, we do know that neurobiologically we are hardwired to enjoy foods, especially foods that are high in sugar, high in salt, high in fat. From an evolutionary standpoint, those foods have served us very well. Foods that were sodium wasn't really in our food system, tens of thousands of years ago, and so foods that were naturally higher in sodium were advantageous to consume because it's an essential electrolyte for all of our, for our heart to function. And so it makes sense that we're drawn to foods that are higher in sodium. And then foods that are higher in sugar, well, that's glucose, and glucose is our muscles' preferred energy source, our brain's preferred energy source. So of course it would make sense that we would be highly stimulated by these foods. Again, from an evolutionary standpoint, foods that were high in glucose were fruits and vegetables, which were also high in nutrients. So it makes sense that we would want to consume these foods. And then foods high in fat were foods that provided us with storage, helped with thermoregulation, regulated our body temperature. So our bodies just haven't evolved to live in this food environment where all these high fat, high sugar, high sodium foods are so widely and unfortunately inexpensively available. And so, there's there's some challenges there, certainly, but it doesn't mean that we're addicted to these substances. It means that we're biologically hardwired to seek out these foods. And there are ways in which we can shift our relationship to food so that they don't necessarily have control over us. I think about just like if I go all day without eating, just because I was busy, right? Not because of for any other reason, I'm just busy and I'm going about my day. And then I come home and my kids have left the chips out. Those chips are going to be very enticing. And I'm probably going to have a hard time just eating a handful of chips, a single serving of chips. Right. But if I came home, I had a good breakfast, I had a good lunch, maybe afternoon, I had a snack. I'll come home. I might have a couple chips. I might not. And then I'll have a dinner and I'll enjoy it. And so that same food, which in one context, I feel like I'm over consuming and I have less ability to slow down and to stop eating. And yet in a completely other context with the same food, I have a very different response to. I think that speaks against the food addiction model. And so I think we can become very attached to the ways that we eat foods, like the process. There might be certain foods that we're used to approaching in certain contexts that elicit a lot of feel-good feelings, and we become really drawn to those feelings and certain contexts where we might overeat those foods. But we can shift that. We can change our relationship to those foods.
Yeah. It sounds like if you are considering the label of I'm addicted to food, it's a really good indication to start to really dive deep, start to assess, start to figure out like what else could this be? Like what else is
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, what is it serving me, and what is the context in which I'm eating the food? And just because of my bias, I'd say, reach out to someone who can help you with this, dietitian and or therapist. But just looking at the context in which that comes up, and it's amazing to see not just getting over the sense of a food addiction, but to see the self-empowerment and the feelings of self-efficacy that individuals can really feel just by realizing they can shift their entire relationship to that food to enjoy it, and feeling like they, it's no longer something that has control over them, but it can take some work to get there. I certainly don't mean to oversimplify it or to indicate that it doesn't sometimes take a lot of work.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, we've covered a lot in a short amount of time. But I think this has been really, really impactful, really powerful. And I just know that there's going to be listeners that really resonate with some of the topics that we covered today. So thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your expertise. It was a fun conversation. It really was.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I'm it's all topics that I'm passionate about, and so sometimes you just have to shut me up, but I really appreciate the opportunity to get to talk with you today.
No, it was a pleasure. It absolutely was. And I just want to say thanks to everybody who is listening and watching, and we will see you in the next episode. Man, I love creating powerful, valuable, and impactful episodes like the one today with Kary Woodruff. And I just know that you were able to find and relate to at least one point within today's episode. I hope you're able to take at least one strategy as well and implement it into your life to create a better relationship with food. If this episode was valuable to you, please like, share, comment, take a screenshot, share it on social media, and tag us. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see you. And we'd love to hear what you found impactful about the episode. You can reach us on Instagram at Wellness Dojo YYC or at Wellness Dojo Podcast, and by searching the Wellness Dojo on all other platforms. Thank you for listening and watching. See you in the next episode.